This podcast is brought to you by B2B Better. Most B2B podcasts rack up downloads, but they never move the needle on pipeline. At B2B Better, we build own media systems that sales teams actually use to close deals. We've helped companies turn their podcasts into revenue engines, shortening sales cycles, improving outbound reply rates, and directly influencing millions in pipeline. So if you're tired of content that looks good on paper, but doesn't drive business results, visit b2b-better.com to see how we do it differently. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Pipe Dream, and today we're going to be talking about the pre-interview call and why it's the secret weapon to making your podcasts absolutely sing. Here we go. So when we first started doing podcasts here at B2B Better, booking guests was a really simple process. We would find someone, we would get them to agree to come onto the podcast, we'd send them a recording link, and then a couple of days later we'd be sitting down to actually do the podcast recording. And it was simple, it was easy, but it didn't work at all, because what it meant that everyone was coming into that opportunity completely cold. The host, the guest had never spoken to each other before. There was no chemistry that had been developed. And it meant that ultimately we had to kind of build the plane whilst it was already in the air. And that just ultimately ended up developing a really bad product. So what we started doing is we started introducing a briefing call before every single episode of the podcast that we produce as a way to achieve three things. One, establish chemistry between the host and the guest, and also determine whether there's any chemistry at all to begin with. Two, to start really fleshing out the topics and themes of the episode and make sure that we're really enabling the guest to bring their best story to the recording. And three, to make sure that from a logistics standpoint, everyone was completely on the same page about when we were recording, how we were recording, and what was going to be needed from all parties, because you'd be surprised how many people have never actually logged into Riverside. So today, I want to be talking to you a little bit about what the guest briefing call looks like and why it's important. So let's get into it. Okay, so first let's talk about the structure of a briefing call and how we actually get to a briefing call in the first place. So when you're trying to book a podcast guest, you always want to ensure that they're aware of the full process. The first step is a briefing call, and the reason that we are getting them onto a briefing call is to cover the three things that I just mentioned, to get the chemistry, to get the topics and themes, and to understand logistics. Once that briefing call has been organized, you can then move into the actual recording date itself and all the follow-up and the post-promotion that's going to come with it. When you get onto the briefing call with a client, you can adapt your own kind of cadence and structure around it, but here's how ours typically go. So the first thing we do as the producers of the podcast that we work on is we make sure everyone is introduced and make sure everyone knows who each other are on that call. We then give a 2-3 minute overview of the podcast itself, what the overarching premise of the show is, and who its target audience. And we do this because we want the guest to have complete clarity and certainty as to what they're actually signing up for. At that point, we hand over to the host, and the host does a short introduction to themselves and to their business, and then we ask the guest to introduce themselves. Now, depending on the show, depending on the host, depending on the topic, we can go in one of a couple of different directions here. So we want to understand what are the topics and themes that our guests are going to feel most comfortable speaking on. And so we can either go into the call prepared because maybe this is a big name, a big influencer. We know what their kind of talking lines are going to be, and we can ask them to kind of dig a little bit into that. Or we can kind of pose a question to them that will just kickstart a conversation. What's your biggest challenge that you're seeing right now? Where do you see the most opportunity in your industry? How did you get to where you are today? And the key thing here is to get the guest talking. We want them to share their insights, their knowledge, to tell their story, so that the host has something to springboard off, that they can get into the weeds with, and we can start fleshing out the topics and the themes of that episode. At that point, we'll have a pretty good sense of the kind of topics, the content pillars that it is that we're going to want to discuss on the episode. And we also allow the host to start sharing their reflections, their insights, their responses to some of the things that the guest has already shared. And from that, we'll have a pretty good kind of base of source material that we can use to then go away and prepare a script. At that point, we then move into the logistics. So when are we recording? What platform are we recording on? What does the whole kind of recording process look like? Is it virtual? Is it in person? Is it on video? Is it audio only? And this part is really key because we also want to set the guest's mind at ease in terms of the risk that they are taking in coming onto our podcast. A lot of the guests that we work with maybe haven't ever been on a podcast before, and so they don't know what to expect. And we want to ensure that they feel absolutely comfortable that what we are posting on their behalf, they are proud to stand up with and to promote on our behalf. And so we go over a couple of the security levels, I guess you could call it. So the first thing we do is we make sure that they understand we will be sending over the questions in advance, and that they have the freedom to change, modify, remove questions, and help us get the script into a place that they're comfortable with. Second, during the recording itself, they can stop at any time, they can take a breather, they can request that we skip a question or modify a question. It's not live, so we have the ability to do that. Third, once the episode is edited, we send it over to them for their review and approval, and nothing gets published without their sign-off. We have found at B2B Better, having done hundreds of these guest briefing calls, that this part of the conversation is often the most important, because it's what gets them over the line in understanding that they're not going to see something appearing in their LinkedIn feed that ultimately is going to land them in hot water. So that's the way that we structure our guest briefing calls. And I want to finish this episode by just summarizing why a guest briefing call is a secret weapon for your podcast. So the first is it turns strangers into collaborators. By going through the experience that the individual has, the topics and themes that they're interested in covering, means that they come to the podcast interview with already a vested interest in seeing it succeed. They're not being thrown into hot water. They're not being asked to kind of answer questions that fall outside of their domain expertise. They are already bought into the whole process and will bring their best selves and their best story to the front. The second reason why these guest briefing calls are so important is because you get the story behind the story. It's easy to look at someone's LinkedIn profile, to look at some articles that they've written, other podcasts that they've recorded, and start building out an assumption as to what the topics and themes are that they may be interested in covering. But they can be out of date, they may not be as relevant anymore, and they may not give the full picture, all the kind of unique angles and stories that the individual can actually bring to the table. So the briefing call is really important to get under the hood of what is the actual story, the differentiated story that they can bring to your podcast. And the third reason is it protects you from wasting your time. You know, it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes you get onto a guest briefing call with a potential interviewee and you just realize really quickly it's not going to work. You know, maybe the chemistry isn't there with the host. Maybe that, their experience on paper doesn't quite match up with the reality. And it's really awkward and difficult to pull yourself out of that interview if you're on the interview itself, if you haven't done the guest briefing call and you just move straight to the recording. The guest briefing call creates an opportunity for you to put the brakes on if the individual doesn't fit at that time. And we'll be doing another episode in a couple of days on how to exit a guest gracefully that doesn't quite work out for your podcast. So that's it for this episode of Pipe Dream. Hopefully it's given you a little bit of a better understanding on why the guest briefing call is important, how to run your own guest briefing calls, and how to ultimately create the best podcast you possibly can. We'll see you next time.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.